My neighbor Fumiko lives 4 houses down from me. She is 89. Her husband passed 6 years ago. Her son lives on the main island of Japan, an hour and a half away by plane. Most days, nobody comes to check on her in any formal sense. And yet she still sweeps her own step every morning. She still cooks her own meals. Twice a week, she walks to the corner to meet 2 other widows for tea, a habit the 3 of them have kept for over 40 years. If you ask most people where I live now, people from other countries, people who visit us, many assume a woman like Fumiko, alone at 89, must either move in with family or move into a facility, that there is no third option. I understand why they think that. In many places, there genuinely isn't a third option. Here, there usually is. And I have spent a long time trying to understand why, not because I think we've solved something nobody else has, but because I think the answer is less mysterious than people expect and more useful than a secret would be. I am not a policy expert and I am not a doctor, but I have watched this play out in my own street for decades. Let me show you what I've seen and what researchers have found sits behind it. My name is Sachiko Yuhara. I am 92. My husband is 95. We live alone in the same small house we built together, without live-in help, without a caregiver visiting daily. Our daughter checks on us by phone most evenings and drives up from Naha most weekends. That is roughly the extent of our support system on paper. I say on paper deliberately, because the paper never captures the whole picture. There is a difference between having a support system that shows up in a government form and having one that simply exists in the rhythm of daily life, so ordinary that nobody thinks to write it down. That difference, I think, is most of the answer to today's question. Most people assume that staying out of a nursing home comes down to one of 2 things. Either you have family nearby willing to take care of you, or you don't, and you eventually need professional care in a facility. A simple either or. That framing misses something important, and it's worth naming clearly. Staying independent late in life isn't really about avoiding help. Almost everyone here who lives into their 90s receives some kind of help: a home health aide, a few hours a week, a visiting nurse, meal support, equipment for the bathroom. The real question isn't whether help arrives. It's where it arrives, whether it comes to you, in the home you already know, or whether you have to leave everything familiar to go find it. In Japan overall, researchers have found that more than 90% of people over 65 say they would prefer to age and eventually die in their own home. In practice, only about 1 in 7 actually manage it nationally. That gap between what people want and what actually happens is enormous, and it exists everywhere in the country, including here. What's different in a place like this isn't that the gap disappears entirely. It's that several things quietly work together to narrow it. Let me walk through them one at a time. Here is something researchers rarely say plainly enough. For most elderly people, it is not usually a slow, gradual decline that ends independent living. It is one specific event: a stroke, a hip fracture, one bad fall on a wet floor. Studies on hip fractures worldwide tell a fairly consistent story. After a hip fracture in old age, a large share of people never fully recover their previous level of independence, and a significant portion end up in some form of institutional care afterward, even if they live completely on their own before the fall. It is, in a very real sense, the single event most likely to end a person's independent life. This matters enormously here because Okinawa's older residents have historically had notably lower rates of the very conditions that tend to trigger that kind of event: strokes, heart attacks, and bone fractures among them, according to health researchers who have studied the region for decades. Bones here, on average, have tended to stay stronger than expected for the population's age. Here is the part I think deserves more attention than it gets. This isn't really about avoiding decline altogether. Everybody eventually slows down. It's about delaying the single tipping point event, the one fall, the one fracture, for as long as possible, because once that event happens, the odds shift sharply. And delaying it seems to come, in large part, from something almost embarrassingly ordinary: staying physically capable through continuous, everyday movement rather than through a period of activity followed by long stretches of sitting. Traditional homes here are built low to the ground. Many older residents still sit on the floor rather than in chairs, which means getting up and down dozens of times a day, an unglamorous kind of leg strength training nobody calls exercise. Gardens are tended by hand, water carried in buckets, laundry hung outside. None of it looks like fitness. All of it adds up to a body that keeps working a little longer before that one dangerous fall arrived. I mentioned my neighbor Fumiko. If she did not answer her door for 2 days, 3 different people would know within the day: the woman who walks with her on Tuesday, the shopkeeper she buys vegetables from most mornings, and her Moai, the small circle of lifelong friends she has met with regularly since she was young. Moai is, at its simplest, a small group, often 5 or 6 people, who commit to meeting regularly for life. Historically, these groups began as a way for villagers to pool money and support each other financially. Over generations, the financial purpose became secondary to something else. They became an informal early warning system for exactly the kind of decline that, left unnoticed, ends with someone alone on a floor for 2 days before anyone finds them. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it isn't really about companionship in the emotional sense, though that matters too. It's about frequency of real contact. Loneliness itself is a slow, quiet problem, but undetected decline, a fall, a stroke, a bout of confusion, is often a sudden one. And what determines the outcome is frequently not the medical event itself, but how quickly someone notices. Most modern support systems, even good ones, are built around scheduled visits: a caregiver who comes Tuesdays and Fridays, a nurse who checks in twice a month. A Moai isn't scheduled in that sense. It's simply woven into daily rhythm so tightly that an absence itself becomes the alarm. I don't think this needs to be a Japanese word to work. What it requires is a handful of people who see each other often enough, indirectly enough, that a missed morning actually gets noticed the same day. This next part is not really about culture at all. It's about policy, and it deserves to be said plainly because it's one of the more overlooked pieces of the picture. In the year 2000, Japan introduced a nationwide system called Kaigo Hoken long-term care insurance. Every resident over 40 pays into it, scaled to income, and everyone 65 and older can draw on it once a doctor and a care manager assess their level of need. What makes it relevant to today's question is what it actually covers: home health aides, visiting nurses, bathing assistants, meal support, physical therapy, home modifications like grab bars and ramps, and adult daycare, all of it available in a person's own home, not only inside a facility. Here is the detail I think is genuinely surprising and worth pausing on. Okinawa Prefecture spends more per person on this long-term care system than almost anywhere else in Japan. More than $3,500 per elderly resident annually, among the highest of any prefecture in the country. That number tells you something important, and it's easy to misread it. It does not mean Okinawans need less care than everyone assumes. It means a great deal of care is being delivered, just delivered differently, arriving at the front door instead of requiring someone to leave home to receive it. I think this is the part people from other countries find hardest to picture, because in many places, meaningful in-home support either doesn't exist or exists only for those who can pay for it privately. Here, it is a standard, publicly available option that most families use as a matter of course, the same way you might use public transportation or a public library. This is not a hidden trick. It is a policy choice made openly, and it changes the entire shape of the either-or question I mentioned earlier. Family and facility are not actually the only two options. There is a well-funded, well-used third path, and it happens to be the one most people say they would prefer in the first place. My daughter lives 40 minutes away by car. My son-in-law's mother lives with her own daughter one town over. Neither of us lives in what people usually picture as a traditional multi-generational household, all under one roof. And yet neither of us would describe ourselves as living without family nearby. What I notice, comparing notes with friends who have children living abroad, is that the distance itself matters less than most people assume. What matters is whether contact is frequent, direct, and expected: a weekly visit that never gets skipped, a daily phone call that would be noticed immediately if it didn't happen, versus contact that is well-intentioned but irregular, easily postponed, easily forgotten during a busy month. Proximity helps, certainly, but I have come to think that predictability of contact may matter just as much as physical closeness does. I want to slow down here because I don't want to leave you with an unrealistic picture. This is changing even here. Younger generations increasingly move to Naha or to mainland Japan for work, the same way young people move to cities everywhere. Villages are aging. Some of the Moai that have run for 60 years will not be replaced by a new generation, forming their own, because fewer young people are staying to form them. Researchers who study this openly worry about what happens in the coming decades, as the very networks I've described gradually thin out. Nursing home use is also rising here, not falling, even as more care shifts toward the home. Both things are true at once. More people using in homes, more people using in-home support, more facilities being built to meet growing demand overall. This isn't a solved problem. It's a place that has, so far, been managing an extremely difficult demographic reality somewhat better than most, not a place that has escaped it. And I want to be honest about something else. Not every elderly person here avoids institutional care. Fumiko is fortunate, a strong Moai, a functioning body, a daughter who called. I have other friends who were not so fortunate, who fell once, badly, and never returned home afterward. The single event problem I described earlier does not spare Okinawa. It only seems to arrive, on average, a little later than it does elsewhere. I've wondered why more countries haven't built something similar to Kaigo Hoken. I don't think it's a secret being withheld from anyone. I think it's genuinely difficult, expensive, and politically slow to build a nationwide system like this from nothing. It requires decades of steady public investment, and most countries are only now reaching the point in their own aging populations where the pressure to build something similar becomes impossible to ignore. The community side is even harder to simply adopt. A Moai took my friends and me 75 years to build. You cannot legislate that into existence, and you cannot buy it. What you can do, I think, is notice what it accomplishes and try to build something smaller and more deliberate in its place. So here is what I would gently suggest if any of this applies to your own life or to someone you love. Ask honestly whether the people who care about you would notice within a day if something went wrong, not eventually within a day. If the answer is no, that gap is worth closing now, while it's simple to fix, rather than after an emergency makes it urgent. Look into whatever long-term care or home support programs exist where you live well before you think you'll need them. Many people discover these systems only during a crisis, when there's no time left to plan calmly, and take the hip fracture seriously, quite literally. Strengthen your legs, your balance, your grip. These unglamorous things appear to matter more for staying independent than almost anything else on this list. It is far easier to build that strength in your 60s and 70s than to try to recover after a fall in your 80s. None of this guarantees you'll never need a facility. Nothing does. But it appears to meaningfully shift the odds and the timeline. Fumiko will be 90 this year. I don't know how many more years she'll manage on her own, and neither does she. But this year, she is still sweeping her own front steps, still meeting her friends on Tuesdays, still calling her son on Sundays whether or not he remembers to call first. I don't think that's luck exactly. I think it's the quiet result of a great many small, unremarkable things, repeated for a very long time. Tell me, if you'd like, what independent aging looks like where you live, whether help tends to come to people, or whether people have to go looking for it. I read what people share. Next time, I'd like to show you the inside of Fumiko's kitchen, a woman who has cooked for herself, alone, every single day for 6 years, and still manages to make it look like company is coming. Thank you for sitting with me this morning.